Well, welcome back. I'm excited for this part because this is where I get to really begin to talk about nonverbal communications. One thing is to talk about the theory and so forth of how the brain works, and it's an important thing. And as we get into this section, I want you to be thinking about what you heard previously and the importance of how the brain deals with the world around us, the beauty of how the brain reacts in real time, and how limbic behaviors are honest. But one of the things that I think are important for you to think about, and as we get ready to jump into the study of nonverbal communications as far as what our bodies are specifically communicating, there are 10 cardinal rules which you have to know to be an effective observer and to elevate your ability to observe nonverbal communications as a professional would. So let's begin by looking at the first one, and that is that you have to be a competent observer. And that means that you have to look around and observe the world around you constantly. I see people walking down the street on their cell phone, oblivious to the world around them, and they almost get hit by cars. Just the other day, I'm watching a University of Tampa student. She's on her cell phone, and she's walking down the street, and there's a homeless person laying down next to her, and she almost stepped on him. So unaware of the world around her. And this can happen to any of us. We are just so caught up in what we're doing that we are not paying attention to the world around us. And I want to create in you the desire, the interest in carefully observing the world around you, knowing that every subtle nuance about our bodies and our thoughts, intentions, and feelings are communicated non-verbally. So this is my challenge to you, is to become a better observer by telling yourself, okay, part of this deal is I'm going to have to be better at this. I can't just turn everything off. I have to actually look at people and see what is it that they're trying to communicate to me non-verbally. The second thing I tell my students is that you have to observe all nonverbal communications in context. And by that I mean that you're at the airport, and at the airport you see a lot of stress behaviors. You see a lot of people touching their necks. You see a lot of lip biting. You see a lot of exhaling with pursed lips and so forth. These are pacifying behaviors. Why? Because travel is stressful. So in context, I have to tell myself, yes, I'm seeing these behaviors because of where we're at. But if I'm with friends and we're talking about sports or we're talking about politics and so forth, we should see a steady stream of behaviors that don't really change, except when we get to something that is either difficult to deal with, painful, or they're objectionable. And we've all seen someone who tells a joke that really isn't funny and makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And we see our own reaction and we see the reaction of other people. In context, we can see how the stimulus, as we call it in science, the bad joke, makes us and other people feel. And so contextually, we can see, aha, this is the right place for these behaviors to show up because none of us liked the joke, and in fact, it made us feel uncomfortable. So context has a lot to do with nonverbal behaviors. When we first meet someone, we may be nervous, we may be tenuous, we may be a little bit reserved. That's expected. But over time, we should become more comfortable, we should become more relaxed, and so forth. So context has to be factored in. And we'll talk later on about context and how context can change rather suddenly depending on where we're at or if something should change. If you're talking to one of your best friends and someone that you particularly don't care for steps into that very room where you're conversing, the context of what is going on has just changed dramatically, dynamically, in fact. And so that has to be factored in, as well as something so simple as something that may be going on in someone's life. I remember running into a dear friend not too long ago, and I noticed that they looked somewhat less than enthusiastic as they were talking to me. And my first thought is, have I done something wrong? Is there some issue here? Have I done something to offend? And over the course of the conversation, I come to find out that they're grieving because they just lost someone. In fact, she had just lost her mother. And so we have to put something like that in context. I was reading the behaviors right. I was seeing someone who was down, who was depressed, who probably didn't want to spend a lot of time talking to me because they're still processing something extremely painful. But that had nothing to do with me. It had to do with their loss. And so a lot of times we see behaviors, but we don't know what the cause of those behaviors are. So we have to always ask ourselves, are we seeing these behaviors in context? And the context comes from the totality of what's going on in this person's life. The third thing we should always be thinking about is the behaviors that we're seeing, are they limbic or are they cultural? Now, I'm going to talk primarily about limbic behaviors. But occasionally we'll see a behavior that is actually cultural. And we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean? I'll give you an example. Most of us, or at least in the Western world, will nod our head in the affirmative, up and down. And when we disagree with something, we will turn our heads sideways to say no. But there are cultures and there are countries where, for instance, this negative side-to-side motion of the head actually is a positive response. You see this in India. And the first time you see it, you're wondering, well, are they saying no? Are they saying yes? Is it negative? What is it? So here's one that could be easily mixed up, and it's cultural. And one of the things that we can do to determine if it's cultural or if it's limbic is, would we see a child at an early age doing this behavior? Where have we seen this behavior before? If it's something that stands out and we see it perhaps for the first time, we have to ask ourselves, okay, is it more likely than not that this is cultural rather than limbic? And therefore we have to find out what it means. And we'll talk about these later, but that's something that a professional observer would look at. And this is no small matter because most of the companies that I deal with, the large investment companies that I deal with, that I've trained, have staffs that are actually from all over the world. They come from so many countries. And they infuse that organization with the vitality of their youth, the vitality of their cultures, but they also infuse that organization with nonverbals that may not be familiar to other people. And so you have to ask, is this limbic or if this is cultural? And sometimes the easiest way to find out is just go right up to them and ask them. So we'll talk about those also. The fourth thing I'd like for you to think about is, are these behaviors unique to this individual? Now, all of us have certain behaviors we do all the time. And they're not really private behaviors. We see them in other people. But we prefer certain things. We might tug at our ear. We might play with our hair. We might like to bite a pencil or something. And so we want to identify those behaviors that are particular to us, that we like, that we prefer. And what we find is that under stress, we will employ certain behaviors over and over again, and we prefer these behaviors. So when we see these very specific behaviors, they have a lot more meaning because these are the behaviors that we have and we favor when we're under very stressful situations. And some of these are manifest by our bodies. I'll give you an example, and it's a personal one. When I'm under stress, my voice goes up. I talk louder and louder and louder and louder and louder and louder. And this is very common to a lot of people. Now, it doesn't happen to everybody, but it happens to us when we're under stress. And it's a very good indicator that I'm either thinking about something or dealing with something that is very stressful. Now, not everybody will have that. Although it's limbic, it's very specific to me. And as I said, my daughter, who loves to pacify by taking strands of her hair to soothe herself. Now, I know a lot of people that do that, but not everybody does that. So I want you to be thinking about those things that are unique to this person, to you, yourself, to your spouse, to your loved ones, and say, well, what does he or she like to do that we see this over and over again? This helps you to identify those things that are unique to this individual, and you will see these things later on. And obviously, the longer we know someone, the better it is. When we look at nonverbal communications, especially when we're thinking about the things that are indicative of thoughts, feelings, or intentions, it's best to look for clusters of behaviors. So you see someone who is biting their lip, touching their neck, maybe massaging the front of their neck, and at the same time, they may be frowning. There's 3 different behaviors, and the brain is communicating there's an issue here. This person is worried about something. Why? Because they're frowning, they're biting their lip, and they're massaging the front of their neck. And if you want to see something like this, just watch anybody testifying before Congress, where you see a lot of stressful behaviors. And the beauty of nonverbals is that we see these things in real time. So someone is asked a question as they're testifying, and then we see the frown, we see the lip biting, we see the massaging of the neck. And by looking at this cluster of behaviors, we can reliably say, oh, they're struggling with this. They did not like that question at all, or they don't like the fact that they have to answer that question. By looking at clusters of behaviors, we have further assurance that what we're looking at is accurate. Stressful situations create stressful responses. So someone comes in to apply for a job, that's stressful. But how do we norm somebody? How do we get the normal behaviors? Well, that's what I want to talk about, because this is another one of those things that are very important for us who study behavior. And that is, what is this person's normal behavior? What does it look like when there's no stress? And that's where a good salesperson, a good physician, a good parent takes the time to calm the person down, to calm the child down, to calm the spouse down, to calm the patient down. So we get a baseline, some sort of baseline that we can work with and say, all right, here we're not talking about anything negative. Here we're not going to make any inquiry. Here we're just talking to try to get as close to a baseline so we can see someone who is not necessarily relaxed, but at least not stressed. So we can see what they look like under what most people would call normal conditions. And then we can move forward and say, okay, here's a person who looks relaxed, is acting relaxed. And when we see changes from that, we can reliably say the brain is being affected in a negative way, and we can take greater reliance in the behaviors that we are observing. So associated with baseline is one other factor, and that is that we need to look for changes from that baseline or changes in behavior. As I said, our limbic brains are designed to react to the world around us in real time. So you and I can be talking about fishing, we can be talking about sports, we can be talking about politics. But the minute, the instant that you say something that I find distasteful, my limbic brain will react to that. And so one of the things that I want to teach you to do is look for immediate changes, spontaneous changes, changes that take place in relation to something. It could be something that someone says. It could be something that you see. I'll give you an example. Scientists do studies all the time where someone is shown a photograph of a baby. And the usual response that they see from the experiment is that whoever's looking at the baby smiles, or it gladdens their faces, or it tends to relax them. And then they're shown a war scene, maybe a famous photograph of an atrocity. And immediately, in tenths of a second, the person who is viewing this photograph will immediately change. Their blood pressure will go up, their pupils will constrict, there is tension in their face. And this is the beauty of the limbic system. It reacts very quickly. Now, in any given day, we're also reacting in real time. Maybe not to something as lovely as the picture of a baby's face in contrast with some war crime, but we, at any given moment, may be talking about things that we favor at work and things that we don't favor. Maybe the boss says, hey, I'd like for you to come in and put in a couple of hours this weekend. And you see the squinting of the eyes. You see the covering of the eyes or the rubbing of the eyes. And the person will come in and work this weekend. But that immediate reaction to the stimulus, which was, I need for you to come in this weekend, is extremely accurate as to how they felt about it. And there is an immediate change in how this person looks, in the countenance. So maybe their face was very relaxed or maybe very normal, very businesslike. But in one instant, all of a sudden we have the squinting of the eyes, an indicator of dislike, and it shows up. There's another thing that is important for us who observe nonverbal behaviors, and that is the primacy of reactions. Primacy has to do with what occurs quickly. And one of the things that I want to share with you is this, that the most immediate reactions are usually the most accurate. So you say, I need for you to come in this weekend, and you see the very quick, what's often referred to as a micro expression. Maybe there's a little grimace, maybe there's a little tightening of the face, maybe there's a little squinting of the eyes. This immediate reaction is the most accurate. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to do it. That does not mean that they're not going to comply. I remember as a child, my mother coming in and say, well, you got to clean your room. And I would immediately do something like roll my eyes or something like that. It's very accurate, my reaction. It's negative to what was just said. That is far more accurate than when we have time to put on a face for social reasons to show that we are content. So often what you'll see is the initial facial reaction of displeasure or grimace or so forth, and then we cover it up with a secondary display. So as an observer, I want to teach you to look for the most immediate expressions as being the most accurate, and using that information as we analyze nonverbal communication. The ninth cardinal rule is that observations that we make should be non-intrusive. Now, I got this term from physics, because in physics we learn that if you intrusively observe something, it affects the experiment. And I find that this happens too in our daily lives. You stare at someone too intently, and they're going to be wondering what's going on. They feel self-conscious, they feel very uncomfortable. So I want to teach you to observe in the way that I observe, which is to not stare directly at someone, but to just relax your eyes and cover everything from left to right that your eyes are capable of covering, so that you can see hand movement, so that you can see blink rate, so you can see behaviors without having to directly stare at the person. Because if you want to make someone very nervous, stare at them. And of course, in some cultures, this is something that can cause you a lot of problems. I was living in New York City, having just been transferred there from Arizona, and I'm in the subway and I'm looking at someone who's dressed a little bit out of the norm, probably staring at him far too long. And suddenly that person turns to me and says, "Did you lose something on me?" And then I realized that I had just violated one of these cardinal rules. I had intrusively observed, and that's something that I want you to work on, is how to look at people without intrusively observing. And the last rule has to do with what we've talked about before, is that anytime you see a behavior, if you're not sure what it means, always divide it up into one of two columns. Does it fit within comfort or does it fit within discomfort? And you're going to find that the majority of the behaviors that we see from the limbic brain either fall in one of these two categories. Fortunately, it's either going to be a comfort display or a discomfort display. So I think at this point, enough of the theory. Let's have fun. Let's have fun by examining the human body and what it tells us. Most people who talk about nonverbal communications usually start with situations or with the face and so forth. I want to do it a little different. I want to do it the same way that I do when I teach at the FBI Academy. In fact, you're going to be getting the same material that I used to teach at the FBI Academy, and now I occasionally teach for the intelligence community. And that's how to observe people, how to observe our human body to see what it's communicating. And so let's begin with the area that I always insist on starting with, and that's the feet. I always like to start with the feet because, as I often say, the feet are the most honest parts of our body. And people look at that and say, "What?" And if you think about it, at an early age, we're often taught to mask how we really feel. I remember my grandmother saying to me, "Don't make that face." Well, we make faces because sometimes we don't like something. And I remember she was trying to get me at the time to eat Chinese food, and I love Chinese food now, but at the time, the consistency of it as a child, I just thought it was very odd. And I remember making faces, and she would say things like, "Well, if you make those faces, it'll stay with you the rest of your life." And we've all had things like that. But at an early age, we're often taught, in most cultures, to mask how we really feel. And in fact, there are some cultures where this is part of the social norm to not reveal anything facially because it's offensive. Certainly, we see this in Japan. And I run into a lot of business people who have had business in Japan and say, well, the Japanese are very difficult to read sometimes. And in part, it has to do with their sensitivity to each other so as not to offend. And so they may be smiling or have a very placid face when in fact they're thinking of something negative. This is intentional. This is part of what happens when we socially mask to not reveal what we are really thinking. But there's one part of our bodies that we really can't mask, and that's our feet. And the feet are honest because when we go back to the limbic brain, and this is where it all starts to come together, our limbic brain is responsible for our survival. Now, we need our feet to get around. And so the limbic brain says, well, I'll allow you to do certain things, but the one thing I will not allow you to do in the face of a threat or a danger or something that would harm you is allow your feet to go near that. And so, once again, when we walk near the edge of the building, it's the feet that hold us back. We may look over the ledge, but our feet will remain at a distance. And I used to see this when I was teaching rappelling on our SWAT team. And we would get individuals who are very courageous, very strong, very physical, but they get on top of that 50, 60-foot tower, and they look over that ledge, and their feet are keeping them away. And that's truly the limbic brain kicking in and saying, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to take care of you by not letting your feet go too close to that ledge. Well, what about daily life? Well, one of the interesting things that we see is, for instance, with couples. When couples are getting along, their feet will often touch. And I remember a few years ago, I was working, in fact, with a quite famous individual in Hollywood. I went out to Los Angeles to do some work with Sam Simon. Now, Sam Simon is one of the original developers of The Simpsons. Terrific individual, great humanitarian, lover of animals, one of the kindest people that I've ever met. And he was kind enough to take me out to dinner. And it's right around his house in the Pacific Palisades. And while sitting down with him, we're talking about nonverbal behavior, and he says, well, what about that couple? That couple has been sitting there, and they are at 90 degrees to each other. She's facing straight ahead. He's facing straight ahead. And they're really not talking to each other. They had just finished dinner. And I said, Sam, look at their feet. And he looks under the table, which wasn't difficult to do because it was in plain view. And their feet were rubbing each other. And I said, this is a great relationship. These individuals are in love. He says, yeah, but they're not leaning towards each other. They're not talking to each other. And I said, they don't. The fact that their feet are touching each other says it all. And what's interesting about this is that here's something that is demonstrative of how we are taught to look. We're taught to look at the head. We're taught to look at the face. We're taught to look at the hands. And yet we miss something that's powerful. And that is what our feet communicate. And our feet communicate a lot. And in this instance, within a few minutes, the couple got up. They didn't talk as they exited the restaurant, but they held hands together, hip to hip, as they walked out of the building. And obviously, you could see that these individuals at that point were very much in love. And one of the things we find is that when we care about people, when we're comfortable around people, our feet will be relaxed enough to actually touch them. And you often see this with children in the back seat of a car. There's some sort of argument going on, and one of the feet of one child touches the feet of the other, and there's this alarm call from one of the children that says, he touched me, or she touched me, or he kicked me, and so forth. We tend to distance ourselves from others with our feet primarily when things aren't good. And in fact, in therapy, one of the things that I have helped clinicians with is to look for, when they are doing couples therapy, is they may be sitting side by side, but where are the feet? Are the feet pointed away? Do the feet of these individuals absolutely refuse to go anywhere near each other or to touch each other? It's one of the great indicators of a very bad relationship is when one or the other in a couple will not allow the other person to touch their feet. And I've talked to a lot of clinicians who have verified that one of the things they see is couples who will sleep together. They'll be in the same bed, but they will absolutely not allow their feet near each other. It's almost as this is the last thing you will get to touch on me. And it's very indicative of a very bad relationship. So we look for the feet to communicate to us, again, comfort, discomfort. When we're comfortable around someone, Our feet will go near that person when we're uncomfortable with someone or a situation. Our feet won't go near them. Here's some other examples. You're in a hallway and you're talking to someone about perhaps a personal issue. Now, you're in the hallway. It's a public area. And you're standing right across from the other person. Your feet are pointed towards each other. Now comes a third person down the hallway. They know both of you. But neither one of you wants this person to join the conversation. But you want to be sociable. So here's what happens. What usually happens is we rotate at the hips and we greet the person, but the feet never move. We do this subconsciously. If we actually wanted that person to join us, our feet would move to create a triad, to welcome them into our space. But because in this instance we're having a very private conversation, we merely rotate at the hips and we greet. Now, if that person has any sort of social intelligence, the kind of thing that Daniel Goleman was talking about in his book, Emotional Intelligence, they would merely greet us and walk away. It's the person who has very few social skills who will not recognize that our feet didn't move and will continue to move forward and then violate our space. But the fact that our feet didn't move is truly indicative of how we really feel. We want to be left alone. We're doing that which is socially required to greet you. But really what we're saying is, don't come near us. So here we have two separate circumstances. We know that we allow our feet to go near people when we feel comfortable around them. And we use our feet to communicate when others are welcome to join us. But what are the other circumstances where the feet communicate information? Well, one of the things we found in looking at juries was that when they were favorably listening to someone giving testimony, their feet would actually point towards the person that was talking. And we see this in business meetings where two people are eagerly engaged in conversation and their feet are pointed towards each other. But one of the interesting things we found with jurors was the minute someone testifying said something they didn't like, or there was a witness on the stand that was saying something that the jury simply was not believing, their feet would turn towards the exit into the jury room. Now, for social reasons, from the waist up, obviously they're still engaged because they have to be. They're in a courtroom, but not their feet. Their feet are the most honest indicators of how we feel on our body, and they would immediately turn towards the exit, in essence saying, I don't want to be here. I want to leave here. And this brings me to another feature of the feet as an indicator of, for instance, emotions. Watch someone who's on a cell phone and maybe they're outside talking. You don't have to be listening to what they're saying, but watch the feet when they plant one foot on their heel and they point that foot straight up into the air. So the toes are straight up in the air. I can assure you that that conversation is extremely positive, that there are very positive emotions associated with that. Why? Like I said, the feet are extremely accurate. And what they're saying is, I'm going to defy gravity. And we'll talk more about gravity-defying behaviors. But I'm going to point straight up to the sky because I feel so positive about what I'm doing. And so without listening to the conversation, you know that they're hearing something good or they're getting good news. And I've often seen this with individuals who have called in, for instance, to the university where I teach, and they're calling in to see what their scores are. And as they're talking, and all of a sudden you see that toe just pointed straight up, and you know that they passed the test and they're excited. And that's why they're defying gravity. But once again, the feet are demonstrating exactly what the brain is feeling or thinking. And the feet wonderfully reveal other things, including intention cues. And these are indicators of the individual wanting to do something. You're talking to someone, you've been at it for a while, and all of a sudden the person changes their posture a little bit, and you find that one of their feet now suddenly points in a direction to where this individual may soon leave to. And this is an extremely accurate intention cue of, I've got to go. Now, people who are socially deficient will miss that, and they'll continue to drag on the conversation. And things may be good between you and this other individual. This may be a great conversation, but the person who has to leave, their feet, one of the feet, will immediately point in the direction, the precise direction that they have to leave. And it's a very accurate indicator of, hey, I need to leave now. We need to terminate this conversation no matter how good it is. So here we have a very accurate intention cue, one of our feet moving in the direction of which we want to leave. But it can also very quickly move away from someone whom we don't want to be with. We can be talking to someone and all of a sudden they say something that we particularly don't care for, or we find contentious, or we find objectionable. And very, very subconsciously, our feet will move away from this person. And the reason we do it is because for millions of years, once again, our limbic brain found that if our freezing behavior doesn't cover it, then by distancing ourselves, we will contribute to our success, to our survival. And this is one of the ways that we do that. Now, one of the other things that's extremely accurate about our feet is how they show emotion. And I gave you the example of someone being on the phone and all of a sudden their toes are pointed right straight up in the air. They're excited. Watch children when they are very, very happy. I live in Central Florida. I often see this with children when you tell them we're going to Disney World. And their feet are jumping up and down. In fact, this is what I've termed happy feet. They get happy feet. They're excited they're going to do something very interesting. But it's not just children. I was at the airport not too long ago where unfortunately I spend a lot of time. And I am watching a man in front of me talking to someone. And as he's listening to the conversation, all of a sudden his feet just start moving up and down, almost like a sewing machine. Truly happy feet. Smile on his face. Those feet are going up and down. And this cluster of behaviors was telling me this individual is excited about something. I wasn't privy to the conversation, but for the rest of the time this individual sat in front of me, I could tell that he was really excited about something. Something positive had gone his way, and he was really excited at that moment with events. And what was telling me that? His feet. His feet were transmitting the information. And one of the reasons that I always like to mention the feet first is that it's one of the areas of the body that we often ignore. And yet it is truly the most accurate part of our body in reflecting how we feel, what we're thinking, and what we are intending. So one of the things that we look for in the feet to show us how accurate they are is orientation. And I often give the example of a child at the dinner table who is trying to be fed some food, and they are trying to sneak away from the table, and you see their feet pointing away from the table towards the exit or wherever. And it's a very accurate indicator that they'd rather be playing than eating. And it doesn't require a genius to figure this out, that this is what's really important. This is what's really going through this child's mind. And it's very indicative of the true sentiments of that child. There are many circumstances in which the feet can help us to identify feelings and thoughts or intentions. And one of them is the way that we move our feet in real time in relationship to other people. You often see this in locations where people are meeting. For instance, in a restaurant while you're waiting to be seated or at a bar, you're sitting there and you may be turned sideways, but the minute someone objectionable comes and sits next to you, what you'll find is that your feet will immediately move away from that person and turn away. And I'm often asked, well, how can you tell if this girl likes me or if this guy likes me and so forth? And one of the easiest ways is to look at the feet, because we will turn our feet towards the things that we like and we will move the feet away from the things that we don't. And so while socially the person may turn to us and greet us, if the feet don't move towards us, chances are the person really doesn't favor us. Now here's another indicator, and it has to do again with courtship behavior, and it's most often seen with women. When they're comfortable around a man, what they'll do is they will dangle their shoe from the tips of their toes around that person. And the reason that they do that is that this is a very playful behavior. It's a very relaxed behavior. It permits them to sort of let loose. The shoe comes off, it's just dangled from the toes, and it's being played with. Now, should that situation change, I assure you the woman will immediately put that shoe back on, and not just put the shoe back on, but turn the feet away. So I tell young people in particular who are in courtship situations that one of the ways to assess if you're being liked is to look for these feet behaviors and see if there's the dangling shoe and so forth. See if the person brings their feet near you. See if they turn their feet towards you, as a very positive indicator of how they feel about you. Now, obviously, because the feet are attached to the legs, we also have to consider the usefulness of looking at the legs and so forth. And like the feet, the legs are extremely accurate in reflecting how we feel, what we're thinking, and what we're intending. Like the feet, the legs are extremely truthful. And I'll give you an example you can try. Go stand in an elevator which is going to be filled with strangers and try to cross your legs. And what you'll find is that your brain is saying, uncross your legs. Now, when we cross our legs, this is usually an indication of comfort. It's a comfort display. And we see it around people who genuinely like each other. When you get together at parties and with family and so forth, you'll cross your legs. And what this does is it leaves you off balance, obviously, and just on one leg. Now, your limbic brain only permits you to do this when you are comfortable, when you are around people that are very nice to you, you feel comfortable around, and so forth. The minute there are strangers present and they are violating your space, or the very instance you see someone that you don't like, or may be a threat to you, you will no longer cross your legs. Your limbic brain kicks in and says, put both feet down, because if you need to escape, in a metaphorical sense, as a survival mechanism for millions of years, this is what I've done. I've made sure that both of your feet are planted in case we need for you to escape. And the crossing of the legs is in fact so accurate that when we are around people, we tend to cross our legs in such a way that we will be off balance towards the person we favor. And I often say that not because I'm clairvoyant, but I can often tell which child is preferred by a parent or which sibling likes which other sibling, because they will cross their legs in such a way that if they were to just be slightly pushed off balance, they will always fall towards the most favored child. Now, I don't want to create any problems at home, but check it out next time you see people crossing their legs. So, crossing of the legs is a high comfort display. We do it when we're comfortable, when we're pensive, we do it when we're around people we enjoy, and then, as I said, it quickly goes away anytime we're uncomfortable in a strange circumstance or there's a threat. And that's why oftentimes you don't see people doing it, for instance, at an ATM machine as they're waiting in line or in the queue, and they're surrounded by people they don't know, and they're going to have to get money and so forth. You see their feet are well planted. You don't see them crossing their legs as they're retrieving their money, and that's because the limbic system simply doesn't allow you to be off balance or be in a weakened state when there may be potential danger. Now, the other thing that the legs in combination with the feet do for us to show how we feel emotionally is something I referred to earlier, and that's gravity-defying behaviors. We really are designed as a species to conserve energy. And when we feel very positive about something, when we feel very excited and energetic about something, we tend to defy gravity. And that's why when the children hear they're going to Disney or some other place they want to go to, their feet start jumping up and down. They get happy feet. They defy gravity because this is an emotional display of something positive. But many times we will be talking to someone. We're talking to someone in the hallway. And as they're talking, you notice that they tend to elevate slightly on the balls of their feet. Now, obviously, this is the legs in concert with the feet permitting this to take place. What does it mean? This is one of the ways that we have of emphasizing. They may be telling a story. Oh, I went to Mexico, and while in Mexico, I went fishing. And while I went fishing, I had a great time. And each time you get to that end of the sentence, you see the person rise up on the balls of their feet. And this is a very positive indicator of emotions. And we tend to defy gravity in this way to show that we feel very positive about something. Now, what's interesting about this is that this is something that liars don't often think about. And that is the emotions that are attached with the story. And I'm not going to get into deception here just yet, but I want you to be thinking about this phenomena of defying gravity for emphasis to show how we really feel about something positive. And then watch it when it goes away or when we don't see it. And for the person who usually and routinely emphasizes this way, it's a very good indicator that something else is going on. Now, in medicine, one of the things that clinicians look for is, for instance, someone comes into the room, do they have a bounce to their step? And one of the things that clinicians find is that the clinically depressed don't defy gravity. You don't see the bounce in their step. They are so burdened with the gravity of their mental illness that their limbic system, which once again controls emotions, does not permit them to sort of bounce into a room, to defy gravity, to do anything which is energetic. And so they look for these behaviors based on the feet and the legs, which show that this individual is so being harmed by what's going on in their brain that they cannot defy gravity. And you can see this at a distance without even talking to this individual. And they look like they have the weight of the world on their shoulders. Now, I'm not trying to turn all of you into clinicians, but I used to see this with my own daughter. She would come home from school, and I could tell when she was having a good day and a bad day, simply because of the way she walked, whether it was slower, and the bounce, whether there was any kind of bounce or not to her walk. And I could tell, okay, she's had a bad day, and it's clearly reflected there without me having to ask her anything. And obviously, people who are tired at the end of working a hard day will often reflect the same behaviors. And one of the interesting things that our legs do to protect us is that they also defend us. And while the feet are designed primarily to get us away from something, our legs are often very useful in defending us from things. And one of the things that you'll notice is that when people are very comfortable around each other, they tend to relax their legs to the point that when they're sitting down, their legs may be actually spread apart. Obviously, this can be cultural, and in America, we tend to do this more than in other cultures where we tend to, both men and women, to wear jeans and so forth, and it's not something you can really do when you're wearing a skirt. But we tend to relax our legs and splay our legs a little bit wider when we're relaxed around each other. But the very instant, something challenges us or we feel uncomfortable, boy, those legs come together. And we often see it with employees as they're sitting around. I was just a few minutes ago in the snack room, and you see the employees sitting around talking to each other, and their legs are very relaxed, very splayed, very comfortable. But I'm sure that if these individuals got called into the boss's office, I'm sure that they would be sitting there with their legs together. Well, why is that? Again, that's the limbic brain reflecting exactly, very honestly, how we feel at that very moment. And our legs do, in fact, protect us. When we feel anything that might threaten us, we tend to bring our legs together. And even more so, one of the things that I found interesting in watching people as they converse while they're sitting is how their legs behave around each other. One of the things that we often do to protect ourselves when we're talking to someone that we're uncomfortable with is we will cross the leg and place the leg high over our knee so that it acts as a barrier towards that person. So even though they may be next to us, all of a sudden, when a particular topic is brought up that we don't like, all of a sudden we lift that leg up and we drape it or place it over the other leg, but we leave it in a very high position so as to act as a barrier. And then, of course, when the topic changes, we undo that. And one of the ways that we show that we're comfortable with a person is to actually point a leg, even though it's crossed, towards the person we're talking with. And then if things should change, we uncross and use a leg as a barrier. And this is pretty much across all the cultures that have been studied. And it's a way of not using our faces, but using our bodies to say, I'm really not very comfortable with you at all. And we use that behavior as a barrier. One of the things that the legs also do, and they do this very subconsciously but very accurately, is reflect synchrony and harmony. And one of the ways that we do that is by how fast we walk. One of the neat things that the legs reflect very accurately is how we feel about the person we're with. When we're with a friend, we usually walk at the same pace. In fact, when they plant their left foot, we plant our right foot. It's almost like a march, but it's very synchronous. It allows us to walk in harmony, walk in synchrony, and it's very indicative of how we feel about each other. Couples who are struggling with each other will often walk out of synchrony because they're thinking differently, they're acting differently, and in essence, they're in a different sheet of music. But when we're in harmony, we tend to walk this way. One of the things that we do, it's an adaptive behavior. And that is that when we're walking with someone who is of higher status than us, maybe a boss, it doesn't matter, someone we respect a lot, maybe it's an elderly person, and our legs and our feet do this automatically. You don't even have to think about it. We immediately adjust our pace of walk to the higher status person. In other words, whatever pace they set, we mirror. And that's why you don't see people walking ahead of the president or walking ahead of the head of State Department or the ambassador, or in my case, the head of the FBI. No matter who you are, one of the things you'll find is that you will always adjust yourself to the person of the higher status. And in fact, this was one of the things we used to do to determine who KGB officers were, because it didn't matter what their United Nations assignment, let's say, was. Maybe it said they were third secretary or fourth secretary, or they were their commercial attaché or whatever. One of the things that we looked for is, no matter what that title was, we looked to see how people behaved around them. And if people adjusted their pace of walking to them, we knew that they were of higher status, because we as a species always adjust to the higher status individual. Now, one other thing that the legs are often used for, and we don't often think of this, but in fact the legs are a great place for us to pacify. And we often see this with individuals who will, for instance, rub the forelegs as they're sitting down. Maybe they'll stroke the tops of their legs. Or when they're standing. I was at the airport the other day, and I'm watching a man who his luggage is being searched. And as his luggage is being searched, he's grabbed the backs of his legs and he's massaging the backs of his legs. And obviously this is a pacifier, not because he's doing anything wrong, but because this is an intrusive event and he's using his legs to pacify. And as we talked previously about pacifying behaviors, anytime there's any self-touching, and obviously the grabbing of the legs and the stroking of the legs and so forth, this sends powerful chemical signals to our brain to soothe us, to pacify us, to calm us down. And that's why you see these behaviors. But I find that most people look to the face and not to the legs for pacifiers, and yet here's one where this individual was obviously rubbing his legs, and we all do it in different ways, to calm himself down, to soothe him. And it's something that we should pay attention to, because many of us, for the sake of social concerns, will do these behaviors under the table, under the desk. So we're nervous, we are struggling with something, and so we see the individual rubbing the legs, sometimes casually, sometimes furiously, in my experience, to try and calm themselves down. I remember years ago, I was interviewing an individual who was suspected of murder, and as I sat him down, I said, well, the reason that I'm here is because there was a homicide, and I'm the person responsible for finding the killer. And the very instant I said, responsible for finding the killer, this individual immediately began to rub his forelegs. And I'm not saying, as you would expect, very casually, very nonchalantly. I mean, this individual looked like he was trying to start a fire by rubbing his forelegs. Now, to me, that doesn't mean he's lying or he's being deceitful or anything. That just means that he is very concerned, very much under stress. And this is his way of dealing with that stress. To my words, I'm here to find that killer. So it was very instructive to me. And in the end, he in fact confessed to the homicide. I think it was just one of those things he wanted to get off his chest anyway. Now, there's several other things that our legs and our feet do for us. And those have to do with the way we stand, our stance. And all primates display a lot of communication through stance behavior. And obviously, when you see someone who's very relaxed, leaning against the wall and so forth, that's very easy to read. Here's a person who's very comfortable. But what about the person who is maybe standing just stiff as a board, ramrod straight? Or they look inflexible, they look strained, they look uncomfortable from the way they're standing. Or they just simply are standing as though they have no care in the world, or they're being disrespectful to you. I often hear this with parents and teenagers. They say, well, it's from his stance. I can tell that he's ignoring me or he doesn't care. And there's a lot of things that we can tell. I tell business people that one of the things that communicates how we feel about our job has to do with how we stand. Do we come into our jobs and do we command our space? When I look at Colin Powell, the ex-Secretary of State, the ex-Joint Chiefs of Staff, when he walks into a room, he commands that room, and he doesn't have to say a word. He does it with his stance. He does it with his nonverbals. Extremely powerful. It communicates so much. And we've all been in front of a receptionist who's by their very stance communicates they don't care. They don't care about you. They don't care about themselves. They are indifferent, and they communicate this with their stance. In courtship behavior, you notice that when people are dating each other, they have a certain way that they stand around each other. They're leaning towards each other. They are excited about each other, and this is reflected in their stance. And then as things fall apart and so forth, you see less of that. Stance is something that a lot of people don't talk about, and yet I feel it's very important. I think it's important not just for dating and not just for day-to-day communication. I think it's extremely important for sales. Your stance communicates so much about how you feel about the product you're selling. If you're a clinician, how you stand lends credibility to what you're saying. If you're trying to convince someone that this is the best way for them to, let's say, be treated or take medication and so forth, how you stand communicates a lot about how you feel about something. And obviously the titans of industry, and I've dealt with a lot of CEOs, both men and women, and these individuals, they command respect and they command attention through their stance. And it also has implications for things that we may not know or not think about on a day-to-day basis. But if there's an emergency, what do we want this person to look like? How do we want them to stand? These things communicate so much to us. What about the stance between people who care about each other? Is it an aggressive stance or is it a comfortable stance? How about the stance of an individual who's trying to communicate trust and warmth? All these things are not spoken. They're communicated non-verbally, and they're extremely powerful. When the dancer comes out and they're ramrod straight, and they're a ballet dancer, and you see their stance, how beautiful it is, and you realize, my goodness, I wish I stood like this. I wish I behaved like this. And they command our admiration and respect because of their stance. One of the things that I often run into in consulting with foreign governments is, how do my security people look? And stance has so much to do with this, because one of the things we have found from research is that criminals will target individuals based on how they stand. Do they look strong, affirmed? Do they look resilient? Do they look like they are aware of their environment? Or are they standing in such a way that they look like they are lost in their own world, that they're incapable of defending themselves, that they look weak? And we find that predators look at these behaviors. In fact, in my study of terrorists, I found that terrorists often selected soft targets, even though there were security people there, based on their stance. How did the security people look? Did they look like they could handle any situation, that they were strong and resilient, or did they look weak and fragile? So stance is something that is primarily derived from our feet and our legs and the power that we project from that. I'll give you an example. Look at someone who walks pigeon-toed, and you say, that individual looks a little weak. They look a little introverted. They look a little bit indecisive. And then you look at someone who stands, perhaps like John Wayne, legs spread apart, very strong, in a very territorial display, and you say, aha, I'm seeing something here. And it has to do with how we use our legs to project strength or weakness. And obviously, a territorial display, a territorial claim, the more space between our legs, the stronger we look. Or our legs can demonstrate some things that no amount of words can capture for us. And I'm reminded of an event that happened in my lifetime when the Pope went back to Poland to meet with the military rulers who were still under Soviet control at the time. And here is a very humble man. He was in his 70s at the time, and as he stood there in front of the military leader of Poland, the military leader's legs were shaking to the point that it was visible. And so you realize the legs were communicating exactly what was in this man's head. And he had armies, and he had power, but he was scared stiff. And he was scared to be in the presence of a very simple man, the Pope. But here was a nonverbal which was transmitting for the world to see that in the face of the Pope, I and my armies are nothing. So we've talked about the cardinal rules of nonverbal behavior, and I want you to go back to these every once in a while and think about things such as context, such as what are the baseline behaviors, such as comfort, discomfort, universal nonverbals, and so forth. And this is part of your foundation, educational foundation, to make you an expert reader of nonverbal behaviors. And then I want you to think about this first section we talked about, which has to do with what's the most honest part of our body. Well, now you know. It's the feet. It's not the face. And this is one place we can always go to. And I know you're going to be tempted to go to the face, but it's the feet and the legs, which communicate so much about how we feel about things. And as we climb up the body and we look at different parts of our torso and arms and legs and shoulders and so forth, you'll see how this all comes together. But always remember, if you start at the feet, you can never go wrong.